I'm a secular homeschool teacher. I teach homeschooled high school students at a secular co-op, and right now we're studying cults, and this is what we learned in week 1. Few things before we get started. Number 1, I'm not an expert. I'm literally a teacher that teaches history and English who has a group of kids that were really interested in learning about cults, what a cult looks like, and the rise of the alt-right and the rise of groups like America First and Turning Point. So that was what we were planning to dive into. I made a video about it and a lot of people were interested, and so I am posting my lessons here, but I'm also posting them on Substack. I'm going to link the video to Substack, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then I'm also going to have some PowerPoint stuff available for other educators who want to work on this with their kids. I'm going to work really, really hard to make sure every bit of information I put on here is correct and accurate. But if you find something that you're like, hey, I don't think that's right, nicely let me know. Because, we can have a discourse and we can have a dialogue. Although I will like to point out that opinions and facts are not the same thing. Just remember that for when we continue. Media literacy is important. I will also be listing all of my sources, all of the really awesome people on this app and on YouTube and stuff that you guys can go watch. That will be on my Substack, the list of sources, so that you can do a deep dive with your own older high school humans as well. Okay, so before we dive into America First and Turning Point and the alt-right and the rise of extreme evangelical Christianity in this country, we have to talk about A, what makes a cult, and B, how do we kind of get to this point in time that we're at right now, right? So that's going to be we're spending a couple weeks on that. So we also hear the word cult used a lot, and sometimes it's an accurate description of what's going on, but sometimes it's not, right? That word is thrown around a lot. So we really have to figure out what makes something a cult versus what makes something a religion. I know there's people out there that would argue that all religions are cults. I think that that's a bit of a overstep, and I also think that there's a lot of nuance in this conversation. There's also people that use the word cult for groups that does not apply to. Like, I know from experience that I've been referred to as part of the LGBTQ cult. That's a thing that people say. That's wild and also not accurate. Some groups, even though the people in the group themselves do not see them as qualifying as a cult, they don't see their behavior as cult-like, what the group is doing is detrimental to society, it's detrimental to themselves. So the definition does fit, even though a lot of people probably would argue that they're not part of a cult. There are certain groups that, the shoe fits. So for a lot of us, I know we can probably pick some cults right out of the air, right? We know some really famous ones. There's Heaven's Gate, there's Jonestown, there's NXIVM, there's the Children of God, there's Scientology, there's the FLDS. I had a lot of people in my comments talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. There are a lot of groups that probably could fit into this category, and that do fit into this category, right? Like, I think the argument can be made that maybe the Mormon church, not the FLDS, but the regular Mormon church, there are people that are going to argue with me and say, no, that's just a religion, it's not a cult. But there are people that grew up in that religion that come out of it and say, no, it really was a cult. So there's nuance and gray areas when we're talking about especially modern day religions or modern day movements. But when we talk about Heaven's Gate and Jonestown and Charlie Manson and all those groups, obviously the first thing we think of is, oh, that was a cult. Broadly speaking, a cult is just a group or a movement with a shared commitment to an extreme ideology. Okay, that's pretty much the general definition, but it's typically embodied with a charismatic leader. So there's going to be one person that's in charge, that's sort of this charismatic, really persuasive speaking. Think of like, the typical used car salesman kind of vibe that we're looking at, right? We have this person that's sort of leading this charge of this extreme ideology, and they are going to be very persuasive, very charismatic, very outgoing, very loud, very able to manipulate people around them. This can show up in a social group with hard and fast boundaries. It can also show up in a social movement with a very specific commitment to an ideology. Sometimes the ideology and the leader are sort of the same. They're one and the same. So we're going to talk about, especially what we see in modern day cult-like behavior. Those groups, a lot of the groups that are online, don't have that one leader. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them have maybe a few people that the group members idolize or emulate, but we're not talking about like a Charlie Manson in some of these groups. There's also this sort of unwavering level of commitment and personal transformation, and then adherence to the group rules, right? The rules, some cults, like Heaven's Gate, had an actual book of rules, right? They had a list of rules that had to be followed, but then some groups that we get into when we're talking about more modern day groups that we see online, they don't have a list of rules, but there's just sort of an expectation of behavior, and the people that have been in longer are going to encourage the younger people or the newer people coming in to adhere to those behaviors. Now, that encouragement may look like love bombing at first and then kind of shift. But in a lot of these groups that we're seeing now, it's not that. It is immediate shame, immediate embarrassment, immediate bullying, and just cutting people down to get them to adhere to the rules, to get them to listen to the rules, to get them to follow the rules, and to also get them involved in a way that seems like only these people understand what I'm going through, and the reason that they're being mean to me is because they understand what it's like for me. In my Substack, I'm going to link a video to a TED Talk that talks about cults and what they can look like, and it's a fantastic video. It's a TEDx video over on YouTube. You can click on it if you want to go to my Substack to read my notes about all of this. There are a few pillars or tenets that we talk about when we talk about a cult, right? Or a group of people that have sort of a groupthink mentality. And those pillars or tenets are kind of what holds up the entire organization. So we've got the first characteristic, which is an authoritarian leader. I'm going to get into all these definitions in a minute. Then we've got exclusivism, and then we've got isolationism, and then we have fear or intimidation with self-policing. Those are our four big ones that we see in every cult. Every cult has these four things. And now they may not have them the whole time, but eventually they have all four of these tenets, and I'm going to talk about those in the next video. I'm going to label all these. They'll all be in a series together. There's going to be like a cult series, and then there's going to be a rise of fascism in 1920s Germany series, and then I might do an LGBTQ history series. I don't know. I have a ton of lesson plans that I've done with these kids, so I'm just sort of flying by the seat of my pants. Also, I am an English and history teacher, so if there's something that you're interested in, you're like, hey, this would be really interesting, or I'm a homeschooler and I want to teach my kids about this subject, let me know. Maybe I'll do it. Okay, I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so let's talk about isolationism, because that's going to be our next characteristic. And I think it's very clear we see this with Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, NXIVM, Scientology. Isolationism can be physical, but we're going to talk about how it looks now in a little bit. As the group becomes more intense and more restrictive, the members are going to become isolated. This isolation might be from family members, it might be from friends who aren't part of the group, and eventually in most extreme cases, we see a physical isolation, right? Jonestown, they moved their congregation to the jungles of South America. Heaven's Gate, they closed their doors and they moved. At one point, they were like living in tents, like in a park, but then they were living in a fancy house in Beverly Hills. Charlie Manson, they were living on the ranch in California. There is this isolation piece that is often physical. Oh, the FLDS, they have their own little section of Utah, right? And so the group is going to relocate to an area that's difficult for others to access, right? You couldn't just wander into Jonestown, right? It was heavily guarded. You couldn't really get there. I think they had like a dirt road as like the airstrip. Like it wasn't accessible to a regular person. I do think it's very interesting that the isolation that we talk about when we talk about some of these older groups versus what we talk about isolation now with the radicalization, especially of young men, that isolation piece looks very different. For groups like Heaven's Gate and Jonestown and Branch Davidians, that isolation was physical. They were living on a compound, they were living in a house, they were someplace where other people could monitor them, so they were being sort of self-policed, and also they could be monitored by their group leader because their group leader often lived with them, right? They all lived together. And so all of those things were happening because they were all together in a space where other people would have difficulty accessing them, right? There were people that were at Jonestown whose family members had not talked to them in years because they could not find them. That's also true of the people that were in NXIVM. If you watch that NXIVM documentary, there is a mom who is amazing, and she could not find her daughter. And this was in like 2009. She could not find her daughter because they just kept moving her from place to place to place. That guy ended up getting arrested for human trafficking. That's a whole other story. But now we're seeing a lot of that isolation that's not occurring physically, right? A lot of these young men are not being physically isolated from their families, but they are self-isolating. They are isolating online. They're in very small groups of groupthink type discussions where there's no one to say, hey, so that doesn't make sense, right? There's no one to say to them, hey, this is a problem. Because they're in an echo chamber, but they're also isolating themselves from their family members by locking themselves in their bedrooms, locking themselves in their basement. They're on their computer, they're on their PlayStation, they're on their whatever, interacting with a lot of these other people who believe the same things that they do. And because parents think they're not running away to Sacramento to live on the ranch with a guy named Charlie, they're not in any danger, right? The computer is not dangerous. They're fine, except that they are engaging in real-time isolation from a belief system that might help inoculate them from what they're being told in these groups, in these chat groups. I would say that a huge rise in these kids that are being radicalized online happened during COVID, because not only were they physically isolated, but they were also isolating themselves from their family. They were finding other people like them online to talk to because no one was leaving their houses. And so there was this huge isolation piece with COVID that I think fed into a lot of the reasons why we're seeing people like Nick Fuentes and his little fan base and Charlie Kirk and his, like, those things happened. A lot of those young men got radicalized because they were already isolated because of COVID, and then the self-isolation and the willingness to engage in an echo chamber online, it was all sort of this perfect storm. There's no physical boundary when we're talking about groups like chat forums or Reddit or 4chan or, whatever, Discord. There's no physical boundaries, but there is still that groupthink. They're still being monitored by the others in the group. If you're not saying the right things, you're going to be ostracized, you're going to be made fun of, you're going to be shamed, you're going to be told to delete yourself often and constantly. And what makes this so much more pervasive and so much more difficult to extricate yourself or a loved one from is because you're carrying the group with you everywhere you go. It's in your pocket. It's in your laptop. It's with you no matter what, right? Your son, who's, let's say, 15, not only did he isolate himself during COVID because he was just on his computer the whole time, but now he can carry around these messages with him. He can be encouraged by these messages anywhere he goes. And that's what makes it so pervasive. How can you be deprogrammed if you're taking the group with you literally everywhere you go? You're taking it into the bathroom with you. You're taking it into your bed with you at night because you're on your phone. You're the likelihood of extricating someone from a group that is literally with them 24/7 is so much more difficult. And as we move into this sort of right-wing extremism and rise of alt-right stuff, we're going to talk about how, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, look at Ruby Ridge and the Randy Weaver incident, Christian nationalism, they had their own space. They had their own compounds. They were physically isolated. But now, with the internet, they can literally reach anyone at any time in any capacity. You just have to find it online. And if it speaks to you, if something you find speaks to you, and we'll talk about sort of this like wellness to QAnon pipeline. We'll talk about the sort of like light misogynism to Groyper pipeline. There are all of these pipelines that exist online that can pull you in without you even realizing it. And if you want to know more about that, there's a fantastic podcast called Maintenance Phase. I will link that podcast. I'll tag them or whatever in the notes in my Substack. Okay, so our next characteristic is exclusivism, and that is exactly how it sounds, right? These groups, the leader or leaders are the ones that they claim they have the answer, right? And that answer could look like a lot of different things. That answer could look like an afterlife, a promise to get into heaven, financial security, fulfillment, happiness, fixing your marriage. It could be self-sufficiency. There are a lot of things that are promised when you first join a group like this, right? That exclusivism of no one else knows what's going on here. No one else knows. I have the answers. I'm the one that can get you this. I'm going to listen to what you have to say, and I'm going to give you advice, and you need to listen to my advice, because if you don't, you're not going to get into heaven. You're not going to have financial security. Your marriage isn't going to be fixed. You're not going to end up happy or fulfilled. And that becomes very dangerous, because it also can tie into why people don't leave, why people can't get out, why people can't deprogram, because they're so convinced that the answer is there. The answer is in front of them. The answer is only here with this group of people. And if I leave, I'm not going to have the answer. I'm not going to get into heaven. I'm not going to be happy. My marriage isn't going to be better. I'm not going to be self-sufficient. I'm not going to be financially secure. NXIVM is a really good example of like the financial part of this, or MLMs, right? We can promise you financial success. You're a stay-at-home mom. You don't have a lot of friends. You might have to move around a lot. I know MLMs are really big on like military bases, and we can give you financial security. We can give you this. We can provide this for you. And only we are going to listen to you, because we're, a group for moms, right? Like, it's that whole thing. Other groups are labeled as living their lives incorrectly. Other groups of people are, and this might be as, subversive as like Scientology, where like you have to cut people out that leave the religion, right? They're labeled suppressive persons, and you no longer are allowed to speak to them. I was going to use the Amish as an example, how they like sort of shun people that leave the Amish religion, but I feel uncomfortable making that. I don't really know anything about the Amish, so I'm not going to make that connection. But it is kind of like that idea of, if you leave, you are not going to have access to heaven, fulfillment, financial security, self-sufficiency. You're not going to have access to any of these answers that we alone have. We have the answers, and if you leave, you are no longer going to have access to those answers. You're not going to have access to your family. You're not going to have access to, getting into heaven, getting into a promised afterlife. There's also this idea of, especially when we see like the Nick Fuentes and the Charlie Kirk and the Turning Point and Q and all of that stuff, when we talk about them having the answers, it's very clear if you listen to any of their speeches, they believe they are correct. They believe that this is why men or young men are suffering. These are the reasons why you don't have a girlfriend. These are the reasons why you're not successful at your job. These are the reasons why you're not attractive. And if you fall into some of those categories, you're gonna hear what they have to say, and it's gonna resonate with you. And when this stuff starts to resonate with people, that's when we get into that sort of recruitment phase, that red pilling, black pilling phase of, oh, well, I don't agree with them, but I do like some of the things they have to say, right? It's that slow pipeline into this program state that you all of a sudden can't get someone out of. If you leave, you endanger your salvation. If you leave, you endanger your ability to be happy. If you leave, you endanger your ability to get into heaven. And that is what a lot of these older cults that had like physical isolation really focused on. With the Branch Davidians, they all lived in the compound at Mount Carmel, and David Koresh would, if someone wanted to leave the compound, like they were like, you know what, this is enough for me. At one point, David Koresh actually told his congregation, like preached to his congregation, that he was told by God that he needed to procreate with all of the wives on the compound, that the husbands and wives could not sleep together anymore, that he was the one that had to procreate with all the wives so that they could build this house of David, because they were going to make an army for God. That was sort of his sermon, right? And some people were like, yo, that's bonkers, bye. And those people that wanted to leave had to sit down with David Koresh in a one-on-one, almost like an exit interview, and talk to him. And sometimes exit interviews would last 4-5 hours, where it was sort of him trying to manipulate and coerce and persuade to get people to stay. There were people that left when he made that announcement, by the way, because it's crazy. And also it goes back to, that's not where it starts, right? They were already living on the compound. They had already been there for quite some time. He had already been the leader of the religion for close to 8 years before he made that announcement that he was going to start procreating with all of the women on the compound. So if you've been involved in a religion for 8 years and you believe that this person is Jesus, the coming of Jesus, the Messiah, the prophet, and then all of a sudden he's saying, hey, God came to me and told me that we need to make an army for God when the apocalypse comes, what do? You've been there 8 years. This exclusivism looks different now when we're talking about a lot of these online groups and the forums and the chats and the 4chans and all that stuff. It looks different now because it's not, invite you into our compound, right? It's not, well, come to Jonestown, see what it's like. You have to be invited to a lot of these places. Heaven's Gate, like, they stopped letting people join at one point. So there's this exclusivism that existed for a lot of these more traditional cults that were physically isolated. But then there's also this exclusivism that exists for a lot of these groups online, right? I feel like you could even say that about MAGA. MAGA's pretty exclusive. It's us against them, right? It's us against this group of people. It's us against everyone. It's us against all the suppressive people. It's us against the people who don't understand us. And this was also a huge issue at Waco with the Waco siege, because the ATF was basically trying to torture these people out of their building. They were driving tanks over the graves of people that had died on the February 28th incident. They were playing like sound torture at night, all night long, so that people couldn't sleep. They were keeping these huge blaring lights on the compound to keep people from being able to sleep. And the FBI and the FBI negotiators brought in some religious scholars to try to talk to the ATF, because the FBI and the ATF were not on the same page when this whole situation happened. And if you don't really know what happened, there's a great documentary. There's a ton of miniseries about it. But basically, the ATF and the FBI created a 51-day standoff with the people of the Branch Davidian cult, because they basically were convinced that they were smuggling weapons. That's the whole thing. So anyway, the religious scholars came in and they were like, listen, this is not how you handle this, because the more you engage in these like sort of terrorizing activities, the more you engage in these antagonistic activities to try to get them to leave, to annoy them out of the building, the more they are going to double down. They believe that they believe in the end times. They believe that their religion is worth dying for. And you driving your little tanks all over the graves of the people that you unalived on the first day of this is not going to get them to come out. It's going to get them to double down on their message. It's going to get them to be even more convinced that they are fighting the good fight, because that's what Koresh is telling them. Their prophet is telling them, you have to stay strong. You can't leave. The devil is testing us. And if they really believe that, which they do, they're not going to come out while you're playing, rabbits being slaughtered over the loudspeaker all night long. They're going to think that you are the work of the devil. And that's why we have, that's why Waco ended the way it did. Because they did not understand, the ATF and the FBI did not understand that these people were so committed to their message that they were willing to die for it. Okay, let's talk about an authoritarian leader. What does an authoritarian leader look like? What is authoritarian leadership? I think that this word gets thrown around a lot, especially right now, because we're talking about authoritarian and government type conversations. But authoritarianism just involves the ultimate acceptance of an authority figure. Their word is the word, okay? They have excessive control over their community, their people, their own children, whoever it is that they're sort of presiding over. I'm sure there are a lot of Gen X people and people that were born in the 70s, people that were born in the 80s that had authoritarian style parents, right? Because when we talk about authoritarian parents, we're talking about the parents that spank their kids. We're talking about parents that are the ones that say, stop crying or I'm going to give you something to cry about because I said so. It's my way or the highway. Corporal punishment. All of those things fall into parenting, the authoritarian parenting style, okay? Because this word can be used for a lot of different parts of life. When we talk about authoritarian governments, we're going to be talking about a government that has one main political party, a highly centralized government, limiting free speech, limiting civil liberties, reducing democracy, removing separations of powers of, state and all of those things, adhering to a very strict set of laws, strict set of rules, often removing due process as well. Think about, obviously, Germany. That's, we know that one, right? Italy with Mussolini could qualify. Sometimes we talk about North Korea as like an authoritarian government, but actually North Korea is more totalitarianism, and so that's a little bit different. But when we talk about governments, maybe we'll talk about that. And I would argue, if you are a black person in the United States or a person of color in the United States, it's always been authoritarian here for you. Literally any point in history, black people were living under an authoritarian government. So when we're talking about authoritarian cult leaders, it's the same thing, right? It's just a person that is exercising excessive control over their community, over their group. When we talk about the rise of the alt-right, particularly in the 80s, as like the IBLP group sort of grew, and what's that fucker guy's name? Jim Dobson. That group, often the father was considered this authoritarian figure over the sort of the head of the household, right? And that's similar to when we're talking about cults, right? They are being led by someone who might refer to themselves as the prophet, the Messiah. They might be the founder of the group. So when we're talking about something like NXIVM, which was just in the news recently, Keith Raniere never referred to himself as like a prophet or a Messiah, but he was the founder of the group, and he definitely carried himself in a way that was prophet-like, okay? Their word is ultimate, their word is final, and members are expected to submit to what they are saying, even if they don't agree with what's happening, because unquestioning obedience is required to stay in this group that you're in, okay? And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how does one end up in the jungle in South America? That's crazy. I would never do that. But here's the thing. That's not where it starts, right? It doesn't start in living in the jungle in South America on a compound where you're not allowed to leave, where the cult leader has all your paperwork so you can't even fly out. It doesn't start there, right? It starts in a church pew. It starts at a meeting hall. It starts in a chat forum. It starts in Discord. It starts in, some sort of weird little thread in the dark recesses of the internet, listening to someone talk who is charismatic, who is confident, who is preaching to you about something that you feel personally connected to, right? There is this love bombing aspect that I think we don't talk about when we're talking about cults. We're not talking about Jim Jones when he was 22 years old and he was basically one of very few preachers in, I want to say Indiana, but it might have been Illinois, where he was demanding that his church be integrated. I believe he had meetings with Martin Luther King. He was very instrumental in a lot of integration policies in Illinois, Indiana, wherever it was that he lived. He was super progressive, and people really flocked to that because it was the 1960s and people were interested in hearing new things, and they were interested in seeing the country move in a way that maybe it wasn't moving fast enough for a lot of them. The point is that these people make you feel seen, they make you feel special, they make you feel heard, and they make you feel like you're not alone. And a lot of people who are susceptible to this already are looking for that validation. They're looking for someone to listen to them. They're looking for someone to talk to. They're looking for someone that recognizes where they are in life. And a good cult leader can recognize who's the wounded gazelle. Do you know what I mean? Like, they can recognize who is going to be the person that they can bring into this group because they're manipulative, they're charismatic, they're narcissistic, and they know what to look for. As we get further into talking about the alt-right and the rise of things like Q and Turning Point and America First, and I would even say MLMs. I think MLMs are huge, have a lot of issues with all this stuff. We're going to talk more about the recruitment techniques that we see now versus what we would have seen, 20 years ago. There's a lot of different recruitment methods post-internet. As we move into talking about the alt-right and extreme Christianity and the rise of a lot of these like online groups of people, we're going to talk about why they're so much scarier than like the Jonestowns and the Heaven's Gate and the Charlie Mansons, because of how pervasive they are and how far the tentacles of the internet can reach, obviously everywhere, because they're so much more detrimental to society as a whole versus being detrimental to just the people who were living like in Guyana, let's say, right, with Jonestown. The people that were in danger at Jonestown were the people living on the compound in Guyana, right? Those were the people that were in immediate danger. But now, especially with the Charlie Kirk, Nick Fuentes, Turning Point, Americaverse, all that stuff on the internet, who's in danger? Because the groups are everywhere. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about today is going to be this fear of intimidation or this self-policing that these groups often engage in, right? So groups will sometimes use the threat of removal. Scientology, this is a big one. Like, we're going to label you an SP if you step out of line. If you don't know Leah Remini, I don't know how you would not know Leah Remini, but she has some great documentaries about Scientology, leaving Scientology. There's a great one called Going Clear that was on a million years ago, and it's fantastic. So if you have access to that, you should watch it, because it talks about this sort of self-policing, fear and intimidation tactics that they use, that is seen in a lot of other groups too. The self-policing is a huge thing too, right? So if we look at a cult like NXIVM, they were telling on each other constantly. You didn't know who you could trust. If you asked a question that was considered sort of out of line, or you don't get to ask these kinds of questions, you were immediately turned into somebody that was higher level than you. Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, all of these groups existed with that self-policing aspect where the other members of the group were constantly watching you. In Scientology, if you're labeled as a suppressive person, you are cut off from your family, you are cut off from your friends, that's it, you're done. Like, there's no going back. So there is that level of fear and intimidation. There's also the fear of, if I leave, I'm not going to get into heaven. And I think that rapture talk and the discussion about the rapture on Threads is a really good example of this. There are so many people on Threads that I saw, or on TikTok that I saw, that grew up in a religion that believed in the rapture, that believed in the end times, that sort of drilled into their heads that this could happen at any time and you could get sucked up off the earth at any point in your life. And there were people that have left the religion and deconstructed, and they were reporting feeling really nervous on the day that this rapture was supposed to take place, because even though they've deconstructed, even though they've left a religion, even though they are not part of this anymore, they still have that little voice in their head that was been drilled into them since the very beginning. That's that fear, that intimidation of get in line, stay in line. If you don't, when we all get raptured, you're going to be left behind with all the heathens. It's okay. You'll be here with me and I'll take care of you. I promise. You're going to get left behind. We're all going to be in heaven, and you're going to be stuck here because you didn't finish your vegetables or whatever the fuck they say to these poor kids. When we move into that discussion of self-policing, when we're talking about some of these online groups, the self-policing is in form, or the fear and intimidation is in the form of relentless bullying, being told to delete yourself, doxing, threats of doxing. There's a lot of blackmail that goes on. I know that this was a big thing. I remember an article that I read a while ago about, kids being encouraged to send pictures of themselves to other people, and then there's this blackmail aspect. But the self-policing and the threat and the fear and the intimidation, I don't know if it can be compared. I feel like it's sort of apples to oranges, right? When we're comparing the threats of not getting into heaven, or we're comparing Scientology kicking people out of the religion, that's not really the same as the shaming and the relentless bullying and the being told to delete yourself constantly over and over and over again, or just being blocked, right? So you might say something in a group that might be considered critical thinking, and they're just going to remove you. That kind of goes back to the isolationism. You're not going to be allowed to stay. They also might dox you, right? They might tell people who you are, and that's a very real threat. I think now people aren't as afraid of that, because a lot of the stuff that's going on is sort of considered fine. There was that congressman who was part of one of those awful online group, like super misogynistic groups. And he was like, yeah, what? I run this group. Who cares? And it was a whole thing. And he didn't care that people knew who he was, which is wild to me. You know, these online communities are not maintaining their ideological commitment through love bombing, positive interactions, positive reinforcement, positive emotions, social bonding. That those things that we see with a lot of these traditional cults, where there's that love bombing phase at the beginning, Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, Branch Davidians, Scientology, all of those, we don't see that with these online groups, right? It's the connection through despair, connection through resentment, connection through anger, connection through nihilism, connection through a lot of these much more dark ideas that are typically blaming women and society at large, right? Society is the reason that things are like this. Society is the reason I don't have a girlfriend. Society is the reason that I'm bald. Society is the reason that, I can't find a job. Women are the reason for a lot of this. They hate women so much and they hate society so much that they are able to police one another and police themselves with this sort of bond over hatred. There's a hatred bond that they have, right? And while groups like NXIVM capitalize on a person's loneliness by trying to make them feel included, by trying to get them to, look, we understand you. We love you. We would never hurt you in the way that other people have hurt you. Come to our meeting and listen to what we have to say, and you will be able to find a spouse. If you listen to what we have to say, if you join our company, if you join our program, if you pay us all this money, we will be able to help you find fulfillment, right? These online groups don't operate like that. They are operating among this ideology that is not, hey, it's gonna be okay. Come be with us and we'll help you figure this out, right? And we're the ones that have the answer. We're the ones that can help you figure this out. But these online groups don't. That's not how it works. You don't have value because you're not attractive. You don't have value because you're not fit. You don't have value because you don't have a high-paying job, and that's what women want. And you are never going to have those things because you're not capable of having those things. And I'm not capable of having those things either. So why don't we just join each other on this forum and we can talk about why society and women in general are the reason that we have failed. Rather than centering on self-help, self-fulfillment, happiness, going to heaven, they focus on a destructive collective identity. They focus on this negative self-image, this nihilistic viewpoint, and the fact that society at large has failed them, and they are in a group together because the rest of society has completely failed to recognize their greatness. What's wild to me about these groups is that not only do they see themselves as sort of like the bottom rungs of society has turned their back on us, it's us against them, it's sort of that kind of vibe, right? But not only that, but they also sort of have this claim that they are intellectually superior or morally superior to a lot of other groups of people, right? So even though you might have a person that considers himself sort of the bottom of the barrel because he's not attractive, he doesn't have a girlfriend, he doesn't have a job, he lives in his mom's basement, whatever the case may be, and he has been radicalized to the point where he believes that it is society and women's fault that he is this way. He also believes that he is morally superior to all women. He is intellectually superior to all women. And they see a lot of the rest of society as sort of shallow and unintelligent. And that internal hierarchy kind of goes back into that authoritarian style leadership. There is bonding over despair and hate and rage and anger and hopelessness and SI type thoughts. There is bonding over rather than mutually reinforcing happiness and fulfillment and spiritual enlightenment, they are reinforcing being completely and utterly nihilistic. I'm going to be posting these videos every Friday. I'm going to be posting on my Substack every Friday with my lesson plans. There will be PowerPoints on there as well. And next week, we're going to be talking about the rise of the alt-right and why we're sort of dealing with the repercussions of the rise of these types of groups in the 80s. And then we're going to talk about